let's talk about the church fathers. John, you spent hundreds of hours. You basically did a bachelor's degree in or the equivalent thereof by studying this topic of church fathers. I mean, you told me something that your life was changed doing this research. Tell us about that.
Well, Michael, when you originally published the manuscript version of the chronological Gospels, I bought several copies. When the version came out, the standard version, I bought cases of it and was handing them out. I thought it was one of the most interesting chronologies I'd ever seen, and I spent a lot of time discussing this with many people. And the church fathers is not an easy subject to approach, because first we have to understand what a church father is. Many of the early Christian writers whose literature has survived, many of them were considered fathers of the church, of the Catholic Church. They were not all Catholics, and many of the sources we're going to quote today are regarded by the Catholic Church as heretical sources. Some of them are church fathers officially, some of them are not. But church fathers are an insight that we get to the text of the Gospels in the early years. Our text that we have, that we showed on the screen earlier, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, these are 3rd century and later text. These are copies of copies of copies of copies of the text that John actually wrote, that Luke wrote. We don't have the original text. Well, one way that we can get closer to the original text that we don't have, we do have text from prominent Christian writers in the 1st and 2nd century, and they quote the text. They write about the text. So we can get an insight into what the text behind our oldest copies is by reading the works of these church fathers.
Let me emphasize a point here. So when you hear this term church fathers, this does not refer to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the authors of the New Testament, and then people who knew those authors, those are sometimes called apostolic fathers, and then the people who knew the authors of the New Testament, those are what are referred to as church fathers. And sometimes they're disciples of those disciples. And when we say church fathers, we are not looking at this as saying, oh, these are the fathers of the church and we must obey them. Nobody at this table considers these to be inspired authors. The importance of the church fathers is they are witnesses to an early text of the New Testament. They read the New Testament, and the question I'm always asking is not how did this church father understand the New Testament? His interpretation is interesting, but what I'm really interested in, what text of the gospel was in front of him? I don't have that text anymore, but I can reproduce and recreate what that text was in some instances by reading what the church fathers wrote. And John, you have this wonderful quote from Metzger and Ehrman, who wrote the text of the New Testament, this definitive book that they study in universities. Read us what they wrote about the writings of the church fathers. There are these things called citations. A citation is when the church father quotes verbatim from the New Testament. And what do they say about the citation?
And they quote the New Testament over 1 million times. Wow. So extensive are these citations that if all other sources of knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, they would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament.
So that's significant. If we didn't have a single manuscript of the New Testament and we only had the church fathers, we could recreate what the New Testament said because they quote it so many times verbatim. By the way, in Jewish studies, we do the same thing with what's called Chazal, or the so-called sages. And these are both technical terms. Church fathers is a technical term that refers to Christian authors from the 2nd through roughly the 7th or 8th century. And Chazal, or sages, is a Jewish technical term that refers to the writings of the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Tosefta, the Midrash. It's a certain period of authorship. And we don't have manuscripts of the Tanakh, of the Old Testament, from the 2nd or 3rd century. We have some Dead Sea Scrolls, right? But primarily, when we want to know what the text looked like in those days, we go and we see when the rabbis quoted it, what were they quoting? Now, there's always a bit of a danger in doing this. Let's take the example of the Mishnah, where the Mishnah quotes, that's the writings of the early rabbis, where they quote the Torah, okay? So we don't have the copy of the Mishnah from the year 200 AD. We have copies from centuries later, 1,000 years later. And sometimes when these things were copied, they were updated. Somebody copying it said, wait a minute, that's not what it says in Leviticus. I've got to change what it says here to match what I know from the weekly Torah reading. And this happened with the writing of the church fathers as well. It even happened with John 6:4. We won't have time to get into it. But there's places where scholars agree that John 6:4 was inserted into a text based on what they believed was supposed to be, meaning text of the church fathers, based on what the copyists believed was supposed to be there. I don't think we'll have time to get into that, but we're going to look at some of the clear, definitive information. And I want to start with a church father named Clement of Alexandria. John, tell us a little bit about Clement.
Well, Clement lived between around 150 to 215. He was an author, and he taught at the catechetical school at Alexandria, which was a prominent place for Bible study. This is the location of the largest library in the ancient world. He dies in Jerusalem. He's got many disciples. One of his disciples is Origen, who becomes a prominent figure. One of the works that he authored was a work called Stromata, which basically means miscellaneous. It's a set of miscellaneous teachings, and in that teaching, he speaks about the duration of Yeshua's ministry.
Can we see what he said? All right. So, and again, what we're asking the question is what was Clement's opinion, but what version of the Gospel of John appeared in front of him? Did he have John 6:4 in his Gospel? We already saw that there were scholars like Zachary Pierce and Henry Brown who believed he didn't have it. And Jesus was coming to his baptism, being about 30 years old. He's commenting on that verse and so on. And that it was necessary for him to preach only a year. This also is written. He has sent me to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, which is the subtitle of Michael's chronological Gospels. That's the verse that is quoted from Isaiah. We'll talk about that in a minute. This both the prophet spoke and the gospel. In other words, he's reading the Gospels, and he's saying it's plain in the Gospel. It's quite clear. The ministry of Yeshua was 1 year. It says the acceptable year of the Lord. That's referring to the ministry of Yeshua. And just to understand the context here, this is from Luke 4:16 to 19, where he's quoting from Isaiah 61, 1 through 2. So Yeshua came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, stood up to read. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. When he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to his captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." And according to Clement of Alexandria, what that means is the ministry of Yeshua was 1 year. Now remember, even Eusebius agreed that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were 1 year, because they really kind of sound like that. Eusebius, who champions the 3.5-year ministry, agrees that there's 1 year here. But Clement is saying, yeah, the ministry of Yeshua was 1 year. Now, Henry Brown, go ahead, Jeff.
What this means is the view put forth in the chronological Gospels is not a new view. It's a view that was taught at the end of the first century, beginning of the second century, into the third century. This is the oldest documented view. There's nothing new about the view that was put forward in the chronological Gospels. This is one of the most prominent schools in the ancient world, and this is one of its most prominent teachers. And this is the view being put forward at that school.
So what Michael is teaching has been taught now for like 1900 years. Michael, are you ready to convert to Catholicism and accept the Pope, please? No. Look, Clement didn't accept the Pope either. I don't know if there was even a Pope in this period. Okay. Henry Brown, who is a scholar we already quoted, in 1844, he writes, "The reading of the text in John 6:4, though it is found, I believe, in all the manuscripts and versions, could not have been found in the text of the first 2 centuries. I brought this quote before. Now you know what he means." He's looking at Clement just like we are, and he tells us that, right? I'm not that smart. I just copied what Henry Brown said, right? I'm looking up the sources. I'm not just taking Henry Brown's word for it, though. I want to see Clement's words for myself. I'm sending these off to Greece to make sure that this is a correct translation. I'm verifying these things. And what Henry Brown said is now verified. In Clement's writing, in the year 200 AD approximately, we do not have John 6:4. Otherwise, how could he possibly say there's a 1-year ministry? He couldn't, right? He'd say it's at least 2 years.
Mm-hmm. That's
now,
right.
Yeah,
we've got John 2 and 3, the first Passover.
That's right.
John 12, the final Passover. If their gospel had John 6:4 in it, none of these people would have been so stupid as not know it would take well over 2 years to cover 3 Passovers. I said that in the introduction, and now it's you're proving this out.
We're just bringing the actual quotes where you can see it for yourself. You can decide for yourself. You don't have to rely on what Michael says. You can agree with Clement and Michael and Zachary Pierce and Henry Brown and other people who have said this. And look, there's another opinion
now
out there.
Vossius.
Vossius actually believed it was more than a year, and he just ignored that verse, basically.
Oh.
he kind of ignored it away. But he mentions that it was the common view in his period. That's why he's important.
Yeah.
Anything to add here, John? You want to?
No, just that, in this case, Clement, you don't have to agree, and this is important to remember. As I'm out discussing this with individuals, I'm constantly, so now you believe everything the church fathers wrote?
Not at all.
Are you returning to Catholicism? I was born as a Catholic. I was baptized as a child. No, I'm not returning to Catholicism. We don't have to agree, even with the opinions of Clement. In this particular citation of Clement here, he's expressing his opinion. This is the conclusion that he's drawn from the gospel. Now, it's kind of far-fetched to assume that one of the most prominent teachers at one of the most prominent schools would be ignorant of plain, simple language in the gospel. However, we know lots of prominent teachers who are ignorant of plain, simple language in the Bible. So we need more than just Clement's opinion.
Okay.
And when we look in the church fathers, we see Irenaeus, we get a little different perspective, and I think we can draw some even more serious conclusions from.
So tell us about Irenaeus of Lyon. He's a guy who wrote. Tell us about him. Tell us who
He
Irenaeus
lived
is.
130 to 202. He was a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp is said to have been the disciple of John. So Irenaeus is one person removed from John himself.
From the author.
From the author.
Wow.
Irenaeus was a second century heretic hunter. He wrote works enumerating heresies and then attacking them.
Right. He wrote a book called Against All Heresies. What was the original title of the book?
On the detection and overthrow of so-called gnosis.
Aha. And so this is the Gnostics that we're dealing
He
with.
particularly wrote against Gnostics, and he had his own view of the duration of Yeshua's ministry based on an interpretation he had of John 8:57. This is the passage about Abraham, and they tell Yeshua, "You are not yet 50 years old, yet you've seen Abraham." Well, when Irenaeus reads that passage, he says, "Well, you wouldn't say that to a 30-year-old." So he must be at least 40, maybe approaching 50 at this point. So Irenaeus believes that there's a 20-year
20-year ministry, right?
20-year ministry. Okay.
And we're not interested in Irenaeus' opinion. We are interested, but because he believed this long opinion existed, and because there was this popular teaching of a one-year ministry, he took issue with one of the teachers of the one-year ministry, and he says, "I'm going to show how little knowledge the Gnostics have." And he says, let's go to the gospel record and count the number of Passovers.
Right.
We can prove that it wasn't a one-year ministry.
So just to be clear, Irenaeus is against the one-year ministry. And what he wants to show is the ministry was more than 1 year, and he wants to count every Passover he knows about to show that these group called the Valentinians are wrong and the ministry is more than a year.
Challenge accepted.
Okay. He says it is very surprising how the Valentinians, and Michael Rood, claim to have found the depths of God and have not searched the Gospels to see how often after his baptism the Lord went up to Jerusalem and there celebrate the feast of Passover. So now he's going to tell you every Passover he knows about. Okay, and what we're interested in is not his opinion, but what version of John appeared in front of him. The first time he went up to the Feast of the Passovers was after he'd made wine out of water in Cana of Galilee in John 2. After that, he went up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover the second time. At that time, he healed the paralytic who had been lying beside the pool for 38 years, and that's John 5. We'll talk about that later, actually. But that's his second Passover, John 2, John 5. Again, he departed to the other side of Lake Tiberias, and now he's talking about John 6. And he's not talking about a Passover. He wants to show you Yeshua went up to Jerusalem, left Jerusalem. Went up Jerusalem, left Jerusalem. And each time he goes up, that's another year. John 6 is cited as an example of him leaving Jerusalem. Nothing is said here about a Passover. Again, he departed to the other side of Lake Tiberias, where when a large crowd had followed him, he satisfied the entire multitude with 5 loaves of bread. Then it is written that 6 days before the day of the Passover, he came to Bethany in John 12. From Bethany, he went up to Jerusalem and ate the Passover in John 13, and suffered on the following day, John 19. Now, everyone will admit that these 3 times of the Passover do not make 1 year. What are Irenaeus' 3 Passovers? John 2, the unnamed feast in John 5, and John 13 in the end, the final Passover. Why doesn't he mention John 6:4? Why doesn't he say there's 4? He believes in a 20-year ministry. There's 4 Passovers we know about. John 2, John 5, John 6 and John 12, 13. Why doesn't he say that? Because apparently in his text, there is no Passover or even a feast in John 6. If there were a feast or certainly a Passover, he would have mentioned it to amplify his opinion. Instead, he says 3 times of the Passover, not 4.
He needs as many Passovers as he can get.
He's even flipping John 5 and turning it into a Passover.
Yeah, this is how ludicrous it is. John 2 and 3 is Passover.
Yeah.
He goes up in the Galilee. He stops at the Samaritan village, then up to Canaan where he turned the water into wine, and then he comes back to Passover again. John 5. Right. That's the next thing that happens. John 2 and 3 is Passover. John 5 is Passover. Yeah. You're an idiot. No, that's Shavuot. That's the next feast.
And and it's not that he's an idiot. He might be an idiot. Okay, fair enough. I don't know. The important thing here for me, whether he's an idiot or not, is he does not have John 6:4, because if he does, he would have mentioned it.
Absolutely.
If John 6:4 was in his text, he would have to have been an idiot.
That's true. So we're no longer establishing whether John 6:4 is original. We're trying to determine, was Irenaeus an idiot? Okay.
And if you're saying that he had John 6:4 in his text, that's the argument for 3.5-year ministry. Irenaeus was an idiot.
Okay. They have said that, not me. Okay. Henry Brown, 1844, a Protestant teacher who's working on the chronology. Because this isn't just I figured this out. I didn't figure this out. I'm looking at these sources, using these resources I have. If I had to do this the old-fashioned way, this would be a 30, 40-year project, and I wouldn't even get to everything. But I had access to these databases. Henry Brown writes, I think incontestably that Saint Irenaeus, that's what he calls him, did not read the words of the Passover in St. John 6:4 if he was so anxious to find a Passover where none was in 5:1. He was not likely to overlook a Passover where one was mentioned, especially as he notices the contents of that very passage. I mean, he mentions John 6 as an example of Yeshua leaving Jerusalem, not coming up to a Passover in Jerusalem. And you could really come to no other conclusion that Irenaeus, just like Clement of Alexandria, around the year 200 AD, read the Gospel of John and did not have 6:4 there in his Gospel. Now, next church father we're going to get to, and this is, I call these the big 3. There's a lot more than 3, but our time is limited here. The next one is called Origen. Origen is spelled E-N at the end. It doesn't mean the origin of something. That's just Origenus in Greek. Tell us a little about Origen. He's really interesting. He's a very important character.
So he was a disciple of Clement. Clement appointed him the head of the catechetical school in Alexandria. And he was interested in the Word of God from his youth. His father, Leonidas, was martyred. He wanted to join his father in martyrdom, and his mother hid his clothes so that he couldn't go outside and turn himself into the heathen place. When his father was in prison, he would visit his father in prison and say, no matter what, don't deny what you believe. This was a man who, from a very early age, wanted to serve. For most of his life, he slept on the floor. He fasted. He did not eat meat. He didn't want to do anything that would distract him from his work in the Gospels. You can agree with his opinion. You can disagree with his opinion. But he was a serious student of the Word of God from early age. He ultimately did get his wish of being martyred. He was tortured during the Decian persecution, and unfortunately he died due to injuries that he sustained during his torture. One of the things that makes Origen interesting and relevant to this conversation is he was schooled at Alexandria. This is the largest library in the ancient world. And you mentioned earlier this issue of multiple text.
Yep.
This is not a Christian issue. It's not a New Testament Christian issue. We have multiple texts. In Alexandria, they had an entire school of people working to determine what's the original text of Homer. Because we only have copies of the copies of the copies. There's some places where they disagree. So Origen was schooled in the secular field of textual criticism to recover the original language of ancient texts. And as a Christian, he's dealing with copies of the originals, and he applies this knowledge in his life to the Christian text, and not only the Christian text, but the Hebrew text as well. He's one of the most prolific Christian authors of all time, even by today's standards. He's one of the most prolific authors. One of the books that he authored is the Hexapla.
Right, the Hexapla is this incredible work. It's really important in the history of studying the Hebrew Bible. So Origen was reading the Bible, the Tanakh, the Old Testament in Greek, in what's called the Septuagint. And what he realized is there are different manuscripts of the Septuagint that don't all agree. And in addition, when you compare the Septuagint to the Hebrew text, which he had access to, it doesn't always have the same. There's verses in the Septuagint that don't appear in the Hebrew and vice versa. And so he created this book called the Hexapla, which was 6 columns. The first column had the Hebrew written in Hebrew characters. The second column had the Hebrew written in Greek characters. They transcribed it into Greek. The third column was the Septuagint, and 4, 5, and 6 were other Greek translations. And he used this to compare each of these different versions. And when they differed, he made notations. And we'll get back to those notations later. They're very important for this entire discussion. But here's why Origen is so important. He lived around the year 184 to 253. And the reason he's so important to our discussion is this was not a man who just blindly accepted every text that was just happened to be in his hand. You know, you were talking before about your friend, and at the end of the discussion, he said, I'll accept the King James because that's the one in my hand. Origen was not like that. Origen was the exact opposite. He went out hunting manuscripts and looking for different documents and comparing them systematically. And going back to the Greeks, when they looked at Homer, to them that was a sacred text. And so they developed this whole science of systematically comparing the Greek tragedies and the writings of Homer and all these different documents to compare them and make sure they had the most accurate version. And Origen said, well, shouldn't we do that with our Bible? And he did that with the Tanakh, and he also did it with the New Testament. And so he's, in a sense, the father of New Testament textual criticism. Textual criticism is this whole science of comparing manuscripts.
And he's also considered the father in the Christian church of allegorical interpretation. And this is important,
That'll be important
and relevant because Origen, he felt very strongly, if we're going to take the literal text and we're going to come up with an allegory that's hidden in the text, then it's extremely important that we have the accurate original wording to the text, or our allegory is going to lead us the wrong direction. So Origen collected manuscripts from all over and diligently studied varieties of manuscripts to make sure he had an accurate text.
Guys, that is so important. If you want to interpret something in the Bible symbolically, allegorically, as a shadow picture of good things to come, first you need to understand the literal meaning of it. Right? I see this all the time. People, I call it the tail wagging the dog. Right? People come up with the symbolic meaning of how something applies to Yeshua, and then they go back and force the text to say that in a literal sense. And they're missing the boat, because if you can't understand the literal, you cannot figure out what the symbolism is. Now, Origen says in his book, First Principles, Yeshua taught only during a year and some months. Basically, Origen read the chronological Gospels by Michael Rood, and no. Look, this was the opinion. This was the common opinion of the church fathers.
Dominant opinion.
Yeah, it was the dominant opinion, at least in these centuries, in these early centuries. Just as his teacher Clement had said, he's teaching the same thing. This isn't the only quote we have. In Luke 4:19, remember Luke 4:19 is where Yeshua reads from the book of Isaiah in the synagogue of Nazareth. Origen writes, following the simple sense of the text, and that is so important because Origen was an allegorist. Right? And allegorically, you can take anything to mean anything you want, right? But he's saying the simple sense of the text, right? Forget allegory. We'll get to allegory. He brings allegory later in this homily. Following the simple sense of the text, some say that the Savior preached the gospel in Judea for only 1 year. And that this was and this is what the passage to preach an acceptable year of the Lord means. And remember, if John 6:4 is in the Gospel of John and there's a third Passover, this is an impossible statement. You cannot have a 1-year ministry of Yeshua preaching. Can't be. It's impossible. You have at least 2 years. Origen on John 5. Now, why are we bringing Origen on John 5? What we really want to do is bring Origen's commentary on John 6. Where's that slide?
So Origen wrote a verse-by-verse commentary on the entire Gospel of John. And he wrote a verse-by-verse commentary.
So all we have to do is open up 6:4
on John 6:4. However, the work is damaged. That portion of the manuscript is missing. And we don't have access. So the closest we go back and the closest we can get is his commentary on the unnamed feast in John 5.
Okay, but we can deduce from that what his view was about John 6. Okay, he says on John 5, but we must reply, and he's replying to those who interpreted the unnamed feast in John 5 to be a Passover. Right? And we already saw that opinion. Irenaeus of Lyon had that opinion. So he's replying to those who have this similar opinion. We must reply to those who say that the unnamed feast in John 5 is Passover, that when he came into Galilee in John 2, which is just before Passover, where earlier he had made the water wine, and after these things there was a feast of the Jews in John 5, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, at which time he healed the paralytic. But in this feast in John 5, but if this feast in John 5 were that of Passover, for its name is not added, the sequence of the account is cramped. Right? There's too many things happening for, event after event, too many events for John 5 to be a Passover. And this is especially the case since a little later in John 7 it is added that the Jews' feast of the tabernacle was at hand. In other words, we can't get a Passover into John 5 between John 2 and John 7 because John 2 is a Passover, John 7 is tabernacles. How can you squeeze a Passover into John 5? So if you can't squeeze a Passover into John 5, you certainly can't squeeze a Passover into John 6. Right? So let's go back and understand this. The sequence of the account is cramped. John 2 is a Passover. John 7 is a tabernacle. There's no way the unnamed feast can be a Passover because the sequence of the account is cramped according to Origen on John 5. And if the sequence is too cramped for John 5 to be a Passover, there's no way there's any feast in John 7. John 6. There's no way there's any feast in John 6, certainly not John 6:4, because then it's super cramped. So even though we don't have Origen's commentary on John 6:4, we can infer from what he says about John 2, 5, and 7 that there's no Passover in John 6. And again, I don't care what Origen's opinion is. What I'm trying to figure out is what text of John did he have in front of him? And when we read in Henry Brown and Zachary Pierce that John 6:4 was added because the ancients, the church fathers, didn't have these verses, they're referring to Clement of Alexandria, they're referring to Irenaeus, and they're referring to Origen and others, which we can't bring everything, right? We're bringing a lot of stuff here. We're running out of time for this section, and there's so much more to bring. This isn't even the exciting part, guys. We're going to get to the exciting part. I want to bring one more church father who has a one-year ministry. There's a lot of them, many. We can't bring them all. In fact, there's a book that, this guy's incredible, John. He's so humble. He sends me an email, and he says, if you have time, read this book. And he sends me a 250-page dissertation, PhD dissertation that he read the day before. He's like, oh, yeah, I spent all morning and the other day. We're like, are you kidding me? Just an Origin, right? This wasn't even on our topic. It was kind of like a side subject to look at. And he poured through hundreds of hours looking through numerous church fathers. When we went through this, we said, there's no way we can do this in 3.5 hours, which is what's been allotted. Oh, that includes another topic we have to talk about. So I said, there's no way we can do this, so we have to, there's a lot of stuff we can't bring. And guys, this is an invitation to you. The invitation is for you to go out and continue to study this on your own. Don't just read the people who say it's 1 year. Read the people who say it's 3.5 years. Listen to their arguments. Hear both sides of the story, right? And decide the evidence for yourself. There's a book that we consulted by Og. What's the title of the book?
The Duration of the Ministry of Jesus.
Okay, so here's a scholar who wrote an entire book arguing it's a 3.5-year ministry, and we studied that book in detail. We're going to bring one last church father before we take a break, and that's Tychonius. And the reason I bring Tychonius, he's pretty late. He's 380 AD approximately, he wrote this book. And Tychonius, he lived after Eusebius. Eusebius is the champion of the 3.5-year ministry, and Tychonius is writing 50, 60 years after Eusebius. And Tychonius writes, and the reason this is important is there's no question that Eusebius had John 6:4 in his Bible. That's not disputed. We're going to see that in our next segment. But Tychonius writes, did he give these precepts? And I love it because Tychonius is writing about Matthew 23, verses 2-3, where Yeshua says the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses. And he's asking the question, why is Yeshua wasting his time talking about the Pharisees sitting in the seat of Moses? He's going to be dead in 2 days, and everything he says is going to be irrelevant.
Exactly.
Tychonius' assumption is everything Yeshua taught during his ministry was only relevant until his crucifixion, and then it was washed away from the world. And his conclusion is, well, it has symbolic meaning for later in the life of the church, but the literal meaning is put to rest with the death of Yeshua. And Tychonius says, did he give these precepts concerning the Pharisees only for the next 2 days? Because after them, he was not alive any longer. But if he had also conveyed these things from the beginning of his preaching, it would have been a year. Because the whole preaching of Yeshua is 1 year, according to Tychonius. So even if on the very first day of his ministry, he said, he talked about the Pharisees and not following what they do, because they sit in the seat of Moses, following what they teach, that would have only been relevant for 1 year. In that year, what need was there to teach what would have been in force only until the Passion? Right? Why is he wasting his time talking about this? And Tychonius' conclusion is that they later have allegorical meaning and significance. But the point here of why this is important is even after Eusebius, Tychonius is reading the Gospel of John in his manuscript, and John 6:4 is not there because he has a 1-year ministry. Now, we're going to see sources that talk about a longer ministry. We're going to talk about Eusebius and other sources that have the 3.5-year ministry. And at least in Eusebius' text, there's no question he's got John 6:4. But what we're already seeing in the first 2 Christian centuries, even into the 4th century, in the 4th century, there's 2 versions. There's a version of the Gospel of John which has John 6:4. And there's a version of the Gospel of John which does not have John 6:4.